Good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to be here. I know we're pressed for time. Just want to first just see a couple familiar faces. I want to acknowledge Mr. Jackson, mentor of mine, several members from the EMC family, J.R. Sanchez, my mother. So good to be here. I also like to thank the College of Business for the opportunity to address my alma mater, Dean Basu, the entire committee for crafting such a wonderful event. And give them a round of applause. I think they deserve it. I also want to say a special thanks to the university as a whole. It's to my understanding that every year the university takes a pause and focuses on a continent or region outside of North America. It shows me that William Paterson gets it, that we can't just continue educating our generation with blinders on, that we can't look at the world just from a Western's perspective, but rather look at it from a global's perspective. And this is how we're going to gain a competitive advantage in the 21st century. So we're very excited about that. Now this year, the focus was put on a continent that drives home for me, one where my ethnicity derives from, where my roots are embedded. The focus this year is on the continent of Africa. Now, as I was figuring out what to talk about, a lot came to mind. I could have focused on the importance of stable and transparent government to create an economic boost, or better yet, the importance of proper management of natural resources to build a healthy middle class in the African countries, as well as a strong foundation. But those are topics that I think folks have spent a lot of time on. What I decided to focus on was an area that I felt doesn't get the press it deserves. Something I feel that will play as a strategic enabler of giving African countries their rightful place at the international stage. It'll be key to developing these African nations, and that is the effective use of information technology. So for the next few moments, I'm just going to briefly sketch in broad terms my views on how to increase the usage of IT throughout African countries. I'm going to lay out 3 distinct strategies that African countries can develop to actually implement information technology. And last but not least, I'll talk how African countries can leapfrog decades of IT development. Now, to set the stage, history defines the continuum of human development in several different phases. You have the nomadic phase, then there was the agrarian phase, which was an era of gathering and farmers. There was the industrial phase, the service phase, and now we're in an age of information. Now, during the earlier phases of human development, African countries thrived with a plethora of rich cities, a strong grasp of math and science, hence the Egyptian architecture. We've seen an extremely sophisticated class system, as well as true civilization. However, when we look at the latter phases of human development, a different story is told about Africa. Now, what we see is a continent, or this is what is told to us here, at least in the West, is a continent that's just plagued with economic toil and several diseases such as AIDS and diabetes and etc. That's all we hear. Now, there are many dynamical events that are responsible for some of the fallouts in African countries. You take, for example, you look at life during the colonial era. What we see is a people who were denied the sovereignty over its own political and environmental decisions. What happened was colonial powers were more so focusing on imposing activities that empowered the colonial people as opposed to the African people. And you can credit lots of that. But that was then. If we fast forward to where we are today, we still have to ask ourselves the tough questions. Why is there a continual lag in some of the African countries in an era of political and administrative independence? Better yet, how do you avoid the form of a new specter of colonialism based on poor distribution of information? These are questions that the African countries will be held accountable to and can't rely on the crutch of life during the colonial eras.
So the focus should be, and which in most cases is building an agenda that's suited for the future of African countries, that will provide economic stability for the people of Africa. Now, my idea is that this can be done. Is it tough? Absolutely. But it can be done. And there are certain countries that we're seeing it happen, such as South Africa. And one of the key things that are going to be essential to get this done is using information technology, because it provides efficiencies and competitive advantages that African countries have never really seen before. And more importantly, it'll be a tool and a mechanism to empower the people of Africa. Now, I may have just graduated college a year ago, but I'm not naive to think that it's as simple as just buying all the latest and greatest technology and you're just going to catch up with the rest of the world. But I do think that there's specific principles and basic steps that, if followed, can provide a unique opportunity for African nations. And I'm going to talk about those. Step number one is building a healthy foundation for an IT market. Now, in order to do this, African countries are going to have to revamp their approach and idea towards information technology on a conceptual level. What I'm talking about, what they need to do is look at things from more of a proactive approach rather than a reactive one. We've seen the stats of population of Africa, close to 1 billion people in Africa. There should be no reason, based on their potential market size, should they be following the trends of IT industry. Rather, they should be focusing on determining them. A wise professor once said that our vision should not be limited to catching up with what exists in the developed world. This will simply guarantee the propagation of the gap between them and us. Now, once African countries have bought the idea conceptually, the next thing, like Mr. Jackson so eloquently put, is ensuring that they have the right policies built in place. Now, when you examine a lot of the problems in most African sectors, what we see is issues and troubles at a policy issue base. In other words, there's policy issues at the base. In most countries, there is policy vacuum in IT with inadequate coverage of areas such as telecommunication and computers. Therefore, the policy aspects of IT must, and I repeat, must be addressed in terms of formulation, distribution, and implementation. In the absence of clear and enforceable policies, what happens is you'll see a market that's going to grow in a haphazard manner in reaction to uncoordinated events, external motives that will also allow improper practices, which will ultimately mean that there will be impaired to the growth of enthusiasm for IT. These policies must provide a rational transfer and application of information technology with some basic guidelines set down by service providers, distributions of equipment, and end users alike. Such areas must include the application of information technology, it must include the use of it, as well as the human resource development and the regulation, deregulations of the market. Now, what this does, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is going to build a healthy foundation for the IT market. But this is just the foundation. There's much more that still has to be done to actually give it the flight it needs. And like I mentioned in introduction, there are 3 basic strategies that, if executed the right way, can provide a unique opportunity for IT to take flight. Strategy number 1 is to build IT into development sectors, priority development sectors, not determined by the West or European countries, but determined by the African governments themselves. Areas such as education, environment, healthcare. IT can be used, yes, to help develop, but they can also serve as a hidden agenda to get folks using more of IT. And that's imperative, and that's important. Well, what I mean, let me give you an example. If you look at the health sector alone, the evolution of EMR, which is a huge initiative in the United States of America, which stands for electronic medical records, if there's better availability of computer facilities, as well as communication facilities and healthcare institutions worldwide, particularly in African countries, you can now see a standardization of health records. This will give the people of Africa they can be more mobile in African countries and be much more effective. Also, if you look at areas such as education, 1988, the World Bank proposed distant learning as an effective mechanism for African countries. IT can serve as that mechanism to take it to the next level. When I traveled to Qatar on a business trip, thanks to Paterson University, one of the things that we studied and one of the things that we saw is that Qatar developed what is probably one of the most incredible things as the educational foundation. In other words, they had technological mechanisms on site, hosted, where they can get educated from countries in the West, universities in the West, such as Carnegie Mellon and other locations. Now, well, what does that mean for them? This means now folks that are getting educated in Qatar can stay in Qatar and be productive in Qatar. Time and time again, a lot of the students or folks in Africa that are raised and get their education system travel to the West to get an education, and they stay here. Hence, they're losing productivity in their country, but distant learning can be an avenue for that. Strategy number one. Strategy number two is following what I call the bandwagon effect. Now, given the fact that IT is a problem across the country, this can be looked at more so at a regional level as opposed to individual countries. One of the wisdoms that we see this from is within the health sector alone. Organization by the name Alma-Ata Declaration as well as Bamako Initiative, they tackled these forms, health issues rather, at a regional level. And what we saw was lethargic governments that were moving, that became much more prosperous and more active. That's what has to be done from an IT's perspective. And last but not least is strong interagency cooperations. You have a lot of agencies in African countries that have the right motives, they're just not working together. And if these people and folks can come together, a lot of great things can happen. Now, I know I just put a couple of problems in 12, 13 minutes. And although it's simply put, I'm sure that they're extremely complicated and very difficult to achieve. I get that. And if you look at Africa's lack of infrastructure from a technological standpoint, at first glance, appears as a weak point. But I actually look closely again. Because in actuality, the fact that the infrastructure is not as built actually serves as something that's a positive advantage if properly managed. They don't have to worry about decades of networking technology that was built on obsolete stuff. They can now invest in cutting-edge technology. And this can give power back to the people. It can give African countries a chance to actually play at the international stage. So my opinion, my thoughts, and I'm back in African continent as a whole, and I'm sure they will rise up to the occasion, is doing exactly that. Thank you so much.